Hello, I am Michael Brendan Dougherty, politics editor at Business Insider, and I'm here with Adam Serwer. Adam, introduce yourself.
I'm Adam Serwer. I'm with Mother Jones Magazine.
Good to have you on Washington Squares
Good to be
again. Here. And there's both a lot and not a lot going on this week in politics, but about what people are saying. So, Adam, I think we were going to talk a little bit about John Derbyshire, a writer from National Review.
It seems almost like a year ago in news cycles, because that sort of happened.
Yes.
It sort of happened over the weekend, and in the midst, we've had George Zimmerman's lawyers saying he went rogue, and then we had the indictment, and now today we have
Santorum dropped out.
It's been sort of a crazy week with like dumb news mixed up with real news.
Yeah.
But I guess we're starting with sort of National Review, who has fired two people, I guess, over the past week or so for links to, I think we're sort of comfortable saying white nationalist types.
Generally. Okay.
The first was John Derbyshire, who I think was, really well known to people, sort of a curmudgeon. He was, an atheist, I believe, and he was very anti-creationism. And he sort of he had this reputation, I think, at National Review for sort of being, a cranky old paleocon. But he also, had been very clear about having controversial views on race, but that came to a real head when he published a column where he was riffing off a lot of pieces that have been done recently in which black parents, tell their children that they're going to be looked at very differently by authority figures, and they have to be careful, especially when it comes to cops, because they have the ability to use lethal force to end their lives. And Derbyshire sort of did the same thing, only his talk was sort of a really warped, bizarro version in which he was telling his children to basically stay away from black people, and he came up with a sort of acronym, which was IWSB, which is Intelligent, Well-Socialized Blacks. Those are okay, because you need them to shield you from accusations of racism.
And he described it as their friendship is an amulet.
I just thought that amulet was interesting because it sort of really emphasized Derb's view that racism is a mystical thing that doesn't really exist, or at least not in any way that matters. But yeah, so that happened, and I'm sort of curious as to what you think about that whole controversy.
Right. Okay. Well, it's there's a lot to say, right? So I come out of a kind of paleocon background, at least, I work for the American Conservative. I still have a lot of the views there. It was founded by Pat Buchanan and Scott McConnell and Taki, the man whose name adorns the website that this essay was published on. And paleocons are generally all grouped together, although there's a lot of different types of them. There's some that are grouped as paleocons because their views on foreign policy, they were against the Iraq War or other wars. Some are grouped there because they're really hardcore immigration restrictionists. So I think paleocon is kind of become this catch-all for conservatives who dissent from the movement, but are somewhere to the right politically of the conservative movement, or who conceive of themselves as to the right of it. And paleocons have this big pageantry of history of being excluded from National Review or from some other outlet because of their views. And there's this mythology that's built up around, when are you going to get fired from National Review? And I wrote an essay about one of these paleocons who didn't work for National Review, Sam Francis, a few years ago. He wrote for the Washington Times, And I noted that there was this element on the right, this populist audience that starts to appreciate a writer not so much for what they say, but for how angry the elite, the elite gets at them for saying it. So there's sort of like this element where once you attract a certain type of audience on the right, they're like daring you to say something crazy and get fired. And then like your firing and the proof of it is like the proof of your authenticity. I want to say I find this an incredibly sick process in a way when it happens to a writer.
It incentivizes the wrong kind of thinking, I think.
Well, it does, and then it also, what happens is the patronage begins to change, right? So your patronage came from respectable outlets at first, and then it starts to come from more and more like alternative outlets that want you to break these taboos on race or some other subject. And naturally you begin to respond, I think not just in what you decide to write, but even in how you think, which is kind of the more insidious aspect of this. Now, Derb's always had these views as long as he's been like a public writer, or views like this. He never quite expressed it this baldly.
Right. I think it's not even that he expressed it this baldly. It was, it was one thing, I think, when he was like, because I remember I've been aware of Derbyshire's race, his racism for like a really long time. And that was just like sort of clear. It was something that was known. I think this time what really sort of crossed the line for people, or I think what offended people, was this notion that he was passing it on to his children. And he was doing it, and I think what enraged people also was just the context of the art of this conversation. So like he's giving this talk to his children about how black people are scary and dangerous, in response to a story when a black teenager armed with Skittles and iced tea was shot to death by someone who was not black. So it just like it seemed like in a way it was Derb's long-standing views as expressed, in the most offensive way possible.
Right. I mean, what I would say is, and I personally, I've met Derbyshire once very briefly. I was at something he spoke at 5 or 6 years ago, and he and I traded a few emails over a long period of time. I mean, like a half dozen emails. I always liked his writing. I actually found him a kind of elegant writer over at National Review, or one of the more elegant ones, even when I really disagreed with him. But there's this element of, on the right, I think now, where people are trying to find what is the line, or is there a line, between racism and, what some of them call race realism, which is like, the bell curve style, I don't know what to call it, rhetoric about how
there are differences, and so we should acknowledge them and deal with them.
And deal with them, and that these differences may partly explain inequality in America.
Right. So I think there's, I mean, Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's kind of what I was getting at. And so, is there a line between those things? I mean, I think a lot of people would say that, a lot of liberals would say, no, I mean, this kind of racial pseudoscience is just that, and it's noxious. All it does is embolden people with a lot of malice. Well, so that's the end of it.
Well, I mean, I definitely come down on that side of the argument, but in part because I just find There's a couple of things. I just find no use to the sort of, in the aggregate, what this means, just because, it's like, it seems like a way to sort of use social science to retroactively justify something you already believe. So, like, number one, the possibility that, say, X group... I'm not the first person to point this out, but the possibility that black people are actually smarter than white people is almost never considered, particularly by those who put forth this hypothesis. And I don't think that's because of statistics. I think it's because of we already arrived with the assumption that the opposite is true. But I also think that it's just sort of meaningless unless we're living in a society where you're evaluating each person, for whether you're talking about for a job or for a school application, on the basis of what their group characteristics are as opposed to who they are as a person. It's just like I just don't find it to be a particularly useful inquiry. And it reminds me, and this sort of argument that like it has implications for public policy. It's like, which is like what that we, I mean, like I just. That it sort of grates behind my eyeball because I think the implications for public policy that people are sort of implying are like we completely divest from something like public education because those people can't be educated. And it reminds me in particular of like, and the way that this, the way that something like this occurred sort of within my conscious lifetime was with the whole crack baby thing. So like, there was this whole conversation in the 90s about a quote unquote bio underclass. And this fit into like a really sort of a ready-made narrative, and it was awesome in some ways for people who wanted to make this argument because instead of like inferiority being like racially ingrained, it was that black people had made themselves inferior through drugs. So therefore, there was no point in pursuing any public policy solutions to questions of racial disparities and crime, poverty, education, anything else, because drugs had already ruined that. And of course, the whole crack baby thing turned out to be complete bullshit. But at the time, it was like widely accepted. Newspaper columnists wrote about it like it was true. When I was growing up, when kids would like act up, and I went to mostly black schools, when kids would act up, other kids would call the kids who acted up crack babies because that was the explanation for why someone didn't know how to act.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
No.
But like this, this is. I'm just like I'm just not sure. I'm just like not sure whether it's like a useful inquiry, and the whole question of racial realism is like seems like a total misnomer to me, because it's not so much realism as it is. It doesn't deal with reality so much as it deals with what. I think what certain people already want to believe.
Right. Well, I don't know. I mean, I'll say I'm not particularly exercised by these inquiries, like these race realist inquiries. I read them, and what's interesting is that I am sort of uninterested in either way. I'm not particularly interested in debunking them or in promoting them, and I think that's because partly I would ground my ideas about human equality or human decency in something that transcends biology, right? So even if we found out that, Russian Jews and their gene stock or something made them the most superior intellects in the aggregate, that wouldn't make me want to treat them as a group differently than any other group. So, I don't see what I'm just, I guess, totally invulnerable to being motivated about this in like a gigantic, about that kind of inquiry in a gigantic way. Mm-hmm. Although I have to say, I guess my provocative thought about race realism is that I do think Conor Friedersdorf tried to write something in the Atlantic saying that this is a sign of, Derbyshire was appealing to like an older audience at National Review. I think that's exactly wrong. I actually think race realism and intellectual racism is something young and like vital and on the rise. Like, I don't see this as like a dying gasp. I see this as like the first hint of something that's coming down the line.
I think you may be right, and I think it probably has. I mean, I think it in part has to do with a demographically changing nation in which there's an increasing perception that there's a zero-sum battle for resources. So, like,
yes.
For me, what's interesting about the Derbyshire thing is it made me think about, so Dan Foster, who's a writer at National Review, who I've done blogging heads with a bunch of times. He wrote what I thought was a very interesting piece about, like, sort of why is it that, thinking about why racists or people like the people at Storefront would agree with conservatives on like certain basic things, and this brought to mind of a controversy that occurred when I was an undergraduate at Vassar, where there was a conservative magazine that was just like sort of trying to be provocative and really sort of piss off liberals and have a good time doing it. And there was an incident that occurred where basically there was a Nazi group in Poughkeepsie that was sort of like coming to their defense and like putting like the room numbers of black students on the internet who are complaining about the magazine. And this was sort of really traumatizing for the conservative magazine because like they were trying to piss some liberals off who were being too sensitive about race or whatever, right? But they didn't think of themselves in any sense as being aligned with these out-and-out racists. Like that's just like, in principle, I think almost all Americans are anti-racist in principle and in the abstract. And this was sort of really weird for them. And I talked to someone who wrote for the magazine, and he was just sort of confused, like he just didn't understand. I was like, well, look, there's a problem. I know where you are on this, and I know that you are not where, the neo-Nazi group is. But there's a problem when they think that you're on their side. It's not so much that you are on their side, it's that there's a problem when they think you are. Because that says something about the language that you're using to talk about this.
It does. I don't know about that. I mean, I don't think I'm prepared to defend this collegiate group from that. But I don't think that's necessarily... I don't know. I'm not in the business, I guess, of preemptively trying to articulate a point in a way to exclude anyone that might be noxious from agreeing with it. Like, I feel like that is too high a demand on our public rhetoric.
Well, sure. But this is a little different from that.
Okay. Well, I mean, I understand. It certainly is a problem for them.
Well, right, but I'm just talking in the context of National Review. There's... there was like Derb, I think, was a very obvious signal to that audience. In the same way that, it maybe, some of the stuff in this magazine inadvertently was to the audience that it eventually came to their defense. But, and I think that is something that is like, worth a little bit of self-examination. I mean, obviously it's true that like, the American Communist Party would prefer a single-payer system, but so would liberals, American liberals who are philosophically opposed to communism. But it does, I don't like there is, in this particular context, I do think there's room for some soul searching, particularly because Derbyshire and this other gentleman, who I believe his name is Weisberg, were so open about what they thought, and National Review still kept them on for so long. I think Weisberg is a little different because his views were less well known because he's less well known. But my question was, why would Lowry let Derbyshire go after this? But why did they? Why is it that he was on so long for the first place, given that his views were sort of, really well known? I mean, he said, he compared racial differences to as being, as much scientific fact as, the orbit of the planets.
That's what you're talking about.
Like that's it doesn't get much clearer than that.
Well, I think that's exactly it. Is that there is. Conservatives and liberals do draw the line differently on this stuff, and it's partly because there is this discussion of what are realistic or knowable differences about race. And I think in Lowry's view, Derbyshire was on one side of that, on the acceptable side of that question, until this piece ran.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe it was just a freak out because it was like this piece got a lot of attention. I mean, it was talked about on Gawker, which everyone that makes media also reads, and so then it got talked about everywhere else. I mean, the piece was kind of going viral.
Yeah.
And it was within 12 hours, there was like this mini movement to fire John Derbyshire for this, which I think is a new phenomenon.
I think that phenomenon is kind of stupid, but we'll go on.
Yeah, I mean, it was funny too because it was like, anyway.
Everybody, I think it's National Review's choice if they want to be associated with that kind of crap. But I just think it's the spectacle of people who never read National Review. Well, this wasn't always the case. I think part of it was that a lot of the criticism was internal this time, and I think that's probably part of why Derbyshire got fired. But it's sort of funny when people who don't read something demand that someone get fired for something they don't, producing content for a product that they don't actually consume.
Yeah, I agree. But I was snarking about this. Maybe this is a little bit of a pivot. One of the reasons I think race realism or intellectual racism is on the rise isn't just the ideas that demographically we're changing and, some people think we're in this zero-sum struggle, as you said. But I think it's also a function of rising inequality, where blacks are on the losing end there as well. I think it's also on to, if you look at American patterns in housing and church attendance and, just look at the demographic makeup of zip codes, we are becoming a very segregated nation. I mean, we already were in many ways. So yes, people of different races, blacks have interactions with whites and vice versa, commercially and running into each other, but they don't. Increasingly, it seems they don't share neighborhoods. They don't. I mean, I feel like we don't talk about that, and
I think. Well, so I think I don't know that we're more segregated than we used to be. I think on balance we're probably less segregated, but we are.
Yeah.
We remain segregated even though the country is getting more diverse.
Right. I just see, though, that there's... My worry is that there's no... if race realism produces interesting science that's interesting beyond, the circle that is interested in it for, obviously nefarious purposes.
So, okay, Michael,
if it does...
One second. Can you explain to me the definition of race realism? Because when you say race realism, I just really think about... I think of some jerk being like, "Oh, come on, you know what I mean." I mean, I just think of someone just sort of,
Right.
you know what I mean.
Well,
I think of someone snidely making a racial assumption with the assumption that the person hearing what they're saying automatically agrees with them. I don't know
Right.
what
I
you mean
understand
as
that.
like an intellectual, like as an intellectual concept beyond like my prejudices that I grew up with are right. I don't really know what racial realism is.
I guess the
So
big
you
thing
should
is, I mean,
explain
listen,
it.
as I said, I'm not the most fluent in it, but the idea is basically that every kind of IQ test that you design, no matter how culturally sensitive you try to make it, that there is some kind of there are gap achievement or IQ gaps that hold between different races. That in general, the average or mean scores for different races fall on different planes. And there may be other dimensions to this kind of study that are yet to be invented or whatever. So, because IQ and income are very heavily correlated in our society, or at least that's what they say, that also explains part of the persistence of inequality. Now, I kind of agree with liberals when they chortle about how lame the attempts at eradicating inequality have actually been. But my fear is that increasingly we're going to live, or we're on our way to living, in a society that's more racially diverse, but also more stratified by class and race, and that this kind of intellectual racism will be the kind of post ex facto justification for the kind of society we're living in. And my worry is that there is no intellectual pushback, that all the pushback is just, oh, you're a disgusting racist. And my idea isn't necessarily like the pushback should be scientific, like we should set out and say, oh, well, we're going to determine to scientifically prove that every gene pool is equal to every other gene pool. Because I think, one, that's probably wrong, and two, misguided. And so I'm afraid that, and I'll say it, that if we don't have some basis for equality or human decency, that outside of materialism, like that this kind of racism is going to become more common because we have no defense against it.
I don't know. I kind of think I'm a little bit more optimistic. I mean, to me, this is the dying gasp of this is this is zombie phrenology. You know what I mean? Like, this is not something that I mean, it's like on the one hand, science, it just I think that it appeals to a certain kind of person. On the other hand, the president of the United States is a black man named Barack Obama, went to Harvard. So
I agree with that.
So like, I mean, like, on some sense, it's like I see it less as as prophecy and more as just like some old stuff that has always been with us and may always be with us, but that is so much weaker than it used to be. That I'm a little less worried about. I'm also a little less worried about it just because I think the definition of race is going to change so drastically in the next 20 years. I mean, what's going to happen when there's a book I read a little while ago that I'm blanking at on the author's name at the moment, but he sort of makes this argument that with the baby boomers retiring, we're going to have this huge opening up of the labor market that's going to be filled, largely by people we today consider to be Hispanic. Now, as anybody who's ever been to Brazil or, read a book about Brazil can tell you, the definition of race is very fluid, and, particularly there where it has a lot more to do with class than it does in the United States. But, I think, this stuff is always shifting. I mean, 80 years ago, we had scientists saying that Italian Catholics were, mentally, incapable of challenging authority because of their, decades being in the Catholic Church. It's just, it's absolutely astonishing the lengths to which people will go to justify with bullshit science how much better they are than someone else. And
right.
there's no there is, and what we sort of generally see is that over and over is that time may not debunk all bullshit, but this is one thing that I'm fairly optimistic about.
Right. I hope you're right. I mean, I guess my fear is more generalized in the sense of probably as a Irish Catholic, and just my intellectual influences, I'm very fearful of eugenic thinking. Mm-hmm. And I do not want to admit the premise that if someone is an intellectual inferior, that their intellectual superiors have the right to abuse that person, end their life, control them, mm-hmm. whatever. Because there are people that are born with less mental capacity. There are people that are born disabled, mm-hmm. or, with a birth defect. And, biology does not... I guess I would only agree with the race realists on this premise that biology does not make us equal. And so I want our civilization to have a basis for the rule of law, mm-hmm. That can withstand, our biological discoveries about each other, whatever we find in the human genome.
You don't think the Constitution is that?
No.
The Constitution as it exists today, as amended post.
No, I don't think. That gets to some other intellectual alleyway that we could fall down. Where, no, it really does. Where I just don't. As a conservative, yeah, I guess I'd love if we had a government that was constitutional in the way that conservatives look at the Constitution. But it's a fucking piece of paper written over 200 years ago. No one really, people only look at it and justify what they want, mm-hmm. from it. So I guess I just don't. I would love it, I guess, if we all venerated the Constitution and had some kind of canonical idea of what that meant. But I don't know. I think your society and culture supersedes a written document from 230 years ago.
But don't you think that is a huge part of our society and culture? I think it is. Just sort of
it informs it in, mm-hmm. some ways, right? I always laugh. It's funny. People were saying that John Derbyshire's free speech rights were being violated.
That always happens because people don't understand what the First Amendment does. It's one of the
exactly.
things. It's one of the strangest things because people react that way, and then 1,000 blog posts are written explaining the distinction between government pressure and private pressure.
Right, or when the Dixie Chicks, when their CDs were getting rolled over by, their free speech rights are being violated if you don't buy their music.
Well, this goes into another. This is actually a conversation that we were having on Twitter. There's definitely, I do think there's people do need to be concerned about coercion other than government coercion, but that's not what the First Amendment does.
Me too, but it also is just this total, this game of. And increasingly, because we're all on Twitter, mm-hmm. and I think everyone is constantly talking to and at each other. Mm-hmm. We're just in this but we're just in this exhausting game of stigmatization.
That's I think a good place to transfer into our next.
Yeah, why don't you explain?
Well, this is sort of an amazing phenomenon for me. So I was sort of like watching on Twitter last night when Hilary Rosen's remarks about Ann Romney not having worked a day in her life suddenly became just like this Twitter thing.
Yeah.
And like this morning, like Hilary Rosen apologized today. It was like all over cable news, and I was just sort of astonished because Rosen was sort of like, Romney advisors are saying, oh, she's an Obama advisor, but she's not an Obama advisor. She's like a general Democrat. She's one of these people who gets described on television as a quote-unquote Democratic strategist, which is a term that is just meaningless. It just means like I'm here to like be a partisan hack and like give you entertaining cable news, which you have because you have to fill a programming vacuum of 24 hours. But like this tempest in a teacup, so to speak, turned into, straight up hurricane by the morning. I'm like continue to be surprised at like how, like I don't even know what happened or how this became such a huge deal.
Well, I think I have two things to explain why it became a huge deal. One, I'm of the belief that the culture war is the only issue, like, that matters to most people. Mm-hmm. And that's expressed not necessarily in clean policy lines about, like, do you favor Roe v. Wade being overturned and then state restrictions on abortion, or do you not? Mm-hmm. I mean in just a pure...
how people see themselves?
Yeah, how people see themselves. And how they think their elites and their rulers see them, right? Like, it's very, it's telling, right, that during the Bush years, suddenly there are maps circulating the internet of, like, Jesus land and then this other part of America that's going to succeed.
I remember that map. That was just liberals being bitter about losing the 2004 election.
That's part of it. No, I think that's part of it. But I think there's a little bit more to it. And then,
well, in terms of like self-identification, sure, yeah.
Right, and then Barack Obama's elected, and then all of a sudden you've got a Republican governor in Texas talking about secession. And it really is...
Secession is the I'm moving to Canada of conservatism, I think.
Right. And great way to put it. So there is this, and you see that really successful politicians, and I'm thinking of like Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, and during his first election, Barack Obama, they have a way of making the constituents of the opposition feel like, hey, you're a real American too, we worship an awesome God in the blue states, and their gay friends in the red states. And, the way that Reagan could be, like, really soft toward, like, a liberal constituency while still being kind of sharp and throwing elbows at a liberal politician. Mm-hmm. So people are very good at that. And what I think we saw last night was soccer moms or independent women are this crucial swing vote. Mm-hmm. We know that independent voters and swing voters don't give a flying monkey shit about policy, generally. So then, here's an opportunity. An Obama ally criticized a mother of 5 who was suffering through MS. Bang, let's hit that all day. And also, the Romney people, I'm sure, wanted to push this because today's the 6th anniversary of Romney Care, right. Or the day when this is exploding, which is an achievement they don't want to talk about. And the Democrats did want to talk about. They were prepared to talk about it in web videos and TV hits and news, in letters that were going out, emails. And Matt Drudge has this way of like knowing that these things are going to blow up. And he puts them right on the top of the site, and that helps it blow up even bigger because every cable news producer basically looks at Drudge to find out what's going to interest people that day. And this was the top story on Drudge this morning. So I feel like that is the big thing. And in one sense, I almost want to forgive it. I do feel like this is... I feel like you and I are the weird ones who have, like, philosophies and sharp ideas about policy and how to achieve our ends. I do feel like most voters participate in their democracy through these cultural affiliations, through these impressions they get of, is this person for my type of people? Mm-hmm. Are Democrats really on my side?
Well, so I think this is sort of weird though, because like I find the Obama campaign's response most mystifying, because they sort of like took the immediate bait and were like, we disagree with this, we don't believe it. It's like, right. There's a stay-at-home mom in the White House right now. You know what I mean? Like, obvious, and there was, like, a lot of angst in liberal circles, about Michelle Obama, who's this incredibly smart, talented, ambitious woman who now is, the first lady. There was, like, angst about that, and Obama writes about it in his book, the sort of decision to subordinate her career to her husband's. But I think that's different because it's, like, a question of choice. You know what I mean? I mean, like, I think the liberal argument of this on B is, like, it's great that, Ann Romney wants to be a stay-at-home mom. Nobody should be forced, to make that choice and to, like, curtail their dreams because, public policy is structured in such a way as to, prevent women from pursuing whatever career that they want to pursue. But I find the whole, like, I think the Obama campaign really reacted poorly I think they themselves elevated it in part by responding so quickly. I think like David Axelrod was on Twitter at like 11 p.m. or something like that, being like, that was wrong what this person who isn't affiliated with our campaign said. I mean, it's sort of, I think maybe that proves that the Obama campaign is thinking about this just the way you are. In terms of like the culture war, not the culture war being like these specific issues, but the culture war being how do we conceive of ourselves and who is for us. I think that sort of suggests that they are seeing it the way that you're seeing it. I just think, part of me thinks that their immediate response signaled it to the people who are trying to figure out, is this dumb or is this like a real thing? It signaled to them that this was a real thing.
Yeah, I think we can say that Hilary Rosen does not work for the Obama campaign. She doesn't work for the DNC, but she is like someone that most of these people know and run into. Affiliated with the upper levels of the Democratic Party, right? And she's been to the White House a few dozen times for whatever reason. I don't know who's briefing her or whatever. Although that's not uncommon. Republican administrations have briefings for their ideological allies as well. So, I don't know what to say about it. I don't. I don't know. I don't have anything particularly to add to what's been said. My instinct is to think it's nonsense, but I know that people want to read about it.
Well, here's the other thing that I'm thinking. I think it's sort of weird. This has been the first pseudo-successful attempt by the Romney campaign to sort of, and I think this is partially why they're gleeful about it, to sort of portray anyone in the Romney family as like an average person. You know what I mean? Mitt has been Mitt has sort of been trying to do this while coming across as, Ebenezer Scrooge, for several months. But Ann Romney sort of like is like much better at sort of the whole down to earth thing. The thing is that she's still a billionaire stay-at-home mom, and like, what Rosen set aside, there's like a very realistic difference here between the kind of mom choices that Ann Romney makes and the kind of mom choices that your average middle-class mother who may be also a breadwinner in a family or maybe raising children by herself makes. This is not, it's actually, this is just a version of what a lot of politicians do, which is they condescend and pretend like they feel your pain when, in reality, they have no idea. but it's just sort of, it's. I think I'm just becoming jaded about it to the point where it's almost hard for me to understand how this could be a big deal.
I mean, I think it's the one thing is though is it's condescending, but it's also very possible that Anne is being completely sincere, and I think most people.
Oh, I think she's being sincere in terms of like responding to what was a personal attack on her.
And not only that, but it's like I think very well off people, and even sometimes very poor people, have to like. People rationalize their station in life, and there's always enough to worry about to fill up the day, right? So, like, if I had won the $640 million Mega Millions prize, like, every study shows that, like, you come into all of this money, and then within a year or two, like, your net happiness goes to exactly where it would have been before you won the money. Like, you're just... So, I think, yes, Anne Romney is a billionaire housewife, but I'm sure she feels like just as mentally taxed as like my mother did, being a single mother and breadwinner for me when I was a child. Now, she shouldn't. There's obviously like a huge difference in being the type of mother who can like delegate to all manner of laborers what my mother would have done herself. But I don't know. I don't blame Anne, and I don't blame the Romney campaign for starting to use her because she's obviously an effective spokesperson.
She is an effective spokesperson. She has that. I mean, she clearly has that sort of. It feels really silly to say this because it just has no connection to whether or not someone's a good president. But I think she connects with people better than Mitt does.
Yeah, I think that's truly true.
At the same time, I just it seems silly to me that we're having a conversation about who said something nasty about whom, and this goes to something we said on Twitter as well earlier. But the whole the whole Rush Limbaugh, Sandra Fluke slut thing had to do, that was at base an argument about structuring public policy. And it was about, the way that attitudes towards certain kind of people, affect how what kind of policy exists. And I think that was like a sort of a fundamentally different question. When we're arguing, and I'd much rather have that argument whether or not, liberals are losing or winning. The argument about, how society is going to work and government's role in making it work is, much more substantive than whether or not you said something offensive about somebody that you should apologize for. And while that, sometimes there's, a substantive underlying issue there, but, here, it really just feels like we're having a conversation about whether or not, about who offended whom and who is angry at what, and not about, a larger issue, a larger underlying issue. It just feels like stupid cable news TV candy.
Right. And it is. And I want to transition to this little epiphenomenon of this Hilary Rosen criticizing Anne Romney thing, which is this is just really gets to me. The Catholic League tweeted out on their Twitter account, and this sounds exactly like Bill Donahue, the face of the Catholic League. Shoot, my Twitter is not coming up. But he basically said that Anne Romney's raised 5 kids, unlike lesbo Hilary Rosen, who had to adopt hers.
That's an astonishingly offensive thing to say.
Yeah, it's funny. I only noticed it because I think the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, Dr. Russell Moore, who has adopted 2 children himself, and I think who was himself adopted.
It also, I'm sorry to interrupt, it seems like an astonishingly un-Catholic thing to say, given the degree to which the Catholic Church is involved with caring for children who don't have parents.
Well, that's exactly what Russell Moore pointed out. aside from being just like stupidly partisan and boring, and so I tweeted, to narrate my own Twitter spat. So I tweeted out that, the Catholic League does a great job of imitating Christ if Christ were a petulant, whiny, defensive asshole. And I've talked about this privately with other Catholics. Oh, and of course, immediately I'm like inundated with tweets about like how I must resent my Catholic upbringing or something like that.
Self-hating Catholic.
Right, I must be. So I've talked about this with other Catholic pundits, other conservative Catholic pundits, and I don't know, I think it's just time to say that I hate what the face that Bill Donahue puts out there of Catholicism. I mean, right now on the Catholic League website, there's like this big complaint about the movie The Three Stooges because Larry David plays a nun, I think named Sister Mary Mengele or something like that. Just some ridiculous thing. Bill Donahue still brings up like a Miramax movie from the 90s called Priest that literally I've never met someone who's seen it. And this is like a major cultural touchstone for him. And it's just, I agree with Donahue that there are like secular forces of secularization that threaten the church and threaten Catholics in the short term, in the long term. But I cannot for the life of me imagine St. Thomas More or Fisher or Beckett just putting out these belligerent asshole press releases to deal with the threats to the church in their time. It's just such a ugly, petty thing, and I just wish people would stop funding him.
I just think like what you're saying is like the sort of like everyday news cycle that we deal with in politics is like metastasizing to the world of religious advocacy.
It is, right? It's this sort of this presentation of ourselves, and we're not the only group that does it, as like we are the eternal victim. They killed Christ, the know-nothings, and Sandra Fluck. It's just one unbroken chain of horror, and our way of combating it is to just be whiny and defensive all the time. I want, particularly as a Catholic, I want exemplars out there that are like confident, willing to bear the scorn of other people. I mean, I don't know, in my New Testament, Christ talks about being a sword of division between families. He says that people will persecute you. So people like making fun of you in a movie. First of all, every group gets made fun of in some movie or another. Mm-hmm. Who cares? Like, I can't imagine anyone this weekend is going to go see Larry David and the Three Stooges and then attack a convent of nuns because of his portrayal of them. So what is the threat? It is just, it's absolutely maddening. And I'm sure I don't want to make a career out of criticizing my co-religionists either, because that can be just as self-righteous and pedantic too. But man, it was so fucking classless what he said, and boring. Anyway, that's my rant on.
No, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think there's sort of, this sort of unbroken chain of victimhood thing is something. This is sort of the peril of like, in Peter Beinart's book, The Crisis of Zionism, which I'm in the middle of reading, he sort of talks about the shift from Jewish organizations, doing a lot of like cultural advocacy and civil rights stuff, and sort of shifting more towards like defending Israel, and how that sort of, it's sort of, in his view, the major Jewish organizations have sort of perhaps inadvertently restructured Jewish identity entirely around the Holocaust, which is like a really problematic thing because there are a lot of really awesome and wonderful and rich parts of Jewish culture that have nothing to do with that. And those are really worth appreciating as well. But I think it's sort of like a similar, I think it's there are probably some Jewish advocacy organizations in the United States that I'm not going to name any names who take a similar sort of approach to advocacy, whereas like it's just like everything is about everybody being arrayed against us and not about sort of the positive things about culture.
It's also just like there's a puerile nature to the whole thing too. Like I said, no one is endangered by Larry David wearing a nun's habit or making jokes about it on Conan O'Brien. Mm-hmm. Like my wife and I were watching Conan O'Brien last night and thought it was funny. Partly we take our faith seriously, but we try not to take ourselves so damn seriously. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. It's just the incentive structure, though, for this kind of engagement with the public is so strong.
Yes. Outrage.
Well, no, and you can contain outrage in a tweet, right? Like you can express it, whereas expressing like the little pleasures of irony or more grandly some theological argument or prophetic witness is actually quite difficult to manage.
Okay, so prophetic witness, yes. Twitter is wonderful for irony, in part because of, as Shakespeare said, brevity is the soul of wit, and being limited to 140 characters, you can get pretty witty. But I do see what you're
true. No, you're right. It's just the I don't know. I guess I'm just tired of this dullness. Like I said, I think that I agree with Bill Donahue that there are all sorts of cultural forces arrayed against us, but it's always been that way.
Sure. I mean, and it's similarly true of Judaism. Anti-Semitism is a real thing. It's been around for a really long time, and it's had some horrific consequences. But like, I mean, I think actually a similar thing is like the whole, I don't know if you remember this, the whole Jew bags controversy, where it's like the Jewish aid. This was the other dumb umbrage controversy recently. It was like the Jewish aid of who was doing Jewish outreach for the DNC was like in a picture in college where like her and her friends are like, they're like, it's the Jew money crew, Jew bags. And it was just like so clearly like ironic reappropriation of anti-Semitic stereotypes for the purpose of humor, which is like something that Jews do. I mean, like this it's actually a huge part of Jewish humor is like turning that around and putting it back on other people. Like that's just like that's. I mean, it's like a when a lot of self-deprecating Jewish jokes were told over Seders over this weekend. You know what I mean? And it's sort of weird to watch this like complete absence of political discourse is like devoid of like any sense of irony, almost deliberately for the purpose of helping this sort of from making this sort of advocacy viable.
Right. I mean, when I was over Easter weekend, when I was burning books banned by the Vatican and oppressing women with my rosaries, I mean, it just, yeah. It's also sad in a way too because I don't know. It makes me thankful for things like Blogging Heads because we do just get. There needs to be some space in the public for something besides outrage and that whininess. I mean, I don't know. It feels like this is probably the worst comparison ever, but Bill Donahue is just like the longest dashboard confessional concert running ever. Like, whining and crying over the, like, slightest dirty look he ever got from a feminist. It's like, I don't know. It's not just bad PR. It's actually bad behavior. Mm-hmm. I guess is what I want to finish on. It's not just bad for some cause. It's just guilty and bad on you. Mm-hmm. So if there's anyone listening to me that gives him money, please stop. Give it to, like, a real legal defense fund or something if you think it's important. They actually have to present arguments in a sane way somewhere. And that's all. Anyway, I think we should wrap there.
Yeah. On that note, it's a good place to end. Well, thank you so much for having me on again, Michael.
Oh, thank you, Adam. It's a pleasure, and we will talk soon.
All right, take care.
Okay, bye.